Well, good evening. My name is Susan Bedwell. I'm a doctorally prepared clinical nurse specialist at the Children's Hospital in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And today I'm going to talk about our research on the effect of a continuous milk warmer on weight gain in the very low birth weight infant. I want to take this time to thank my co-PIs, Dr. Chris Sekar and Barbara Buster, and then all the loving mothers who so graciously allowed their children to be a part of this study. The supplies and equipment was provided by Medela, but there was no financial support. So, background about milk feedings or warming milk feedings. As a nurse for 30 years, this is something I've done from the very beginning of my career, and it was done way before I even started. Milk warming is kind of an innate for a nurse because we feel like it comes out of mom at body temperature, so we should be feeding it at body temperature. And I think it also goes back to that time when you're small and your mom gave you warm milk to help you go to sleep. It made you more comfortable and more relaxed. And so for nursing practice, it's been around forever. Unfortunately, there's no real standard, and there's no real evidence to back up warming milk. But when you talk about nurse perception of warming milk, in a study in 2013, about 50% of nurses felt like it was clinically significant to warm milk, even in the lack of any evidence. So all the studies really showed no physiological benefits from warming milk. Dumb in 2014 warmed milk in a hot water bath to a temperature of about 21.8 to 36.2, and aside from an increase in body temperature, there was no difference in gastric residuals, heart rate, respirations, or oxygen saturations. A little earlier, Gonzalez had a study that showed a decrease in residuals, but there was no change in metabolic rates. And no other studies have found any benefit to warming milk for the premature infant. All these studies used a hot water bath for the method of warming milk. And if you're unfamiliar of how nurses warm milk, they take the milk either from the refrigerator to the freezer, and they get a container and they fill it with hot water, either from the tap or from a hot water dispenser, and they put the milk in it until they get around to taking the milk out and giving it to the baby. That 2013 study I was talking about perceptions of nurses, found that most nurses think that they're warming that temperature somewhere between 35.5 and 37.2, when in reality, when they actually measured the temperature, it was between 22 and 46 degrees. So there was a study in 2015 that looked at that variation in human milk based on this hot water bath, and found that those temperatures ranged anywhere between 33 and 65 degrees Celsius. And it depended on the volume of milk, the container it was in, and how long it was kept in the water bath. And I can tell you as a nurse, we don't time it. We put it in the water bath, and when we get around to feeding it, that's when we go forward. So this method allows not only for overwarming and pockets of cold and hot within the milk, but it also allows progressive cooling before it even gets to the baby. So there's no standard temperature, or there's no consistent temperature to the baby. No published studies have used a continuous milk warmer for bolus feedings that delivers milk at a physiological temperature to the baby. There's a lot of devices out there for warming milk. A lot of them warm the container, but the Guardian Medela is the only one that actually warms it just before it gets to the baby. And that setup looks like this. The continuous warmer externally heats the milk in the tubing about 4 inches before it's connected to the OG tube. And it heats it up to 38 degrees Celsius. So by the time it gets to the baby, it is that physiological temperature. If you'll notice, the syringe is farther away. So the nurse does not have to warm the syringe at all. They take it right out of the refrigerator, connect it to the tubing, and then the warmer warms it right before it gets to the baby. So we wanted to know if a continuous milk warmer could improve weight gain in very low birth weight babies over a 10-day period. There have been no studies on that, and there really weren't any studies on the water bath looking at weight gain either. We looked at 44 infants, less than 32 weeks gestation, that were admitted to the OU Medical Center NICU, and we randomly assigned them to either the experimental or the control group. All these infants were on full human milk feedings according to our standardized feeding protocol, which was 120 to 130 kilocalories per kilo per day. All babies were on full mother's milk that was fortified by using Prolacta in a 3 to 7, or Prolacta 6, which is a 3-part Prolacta to a 7-part human milk. All babies were on room air, so we didn't want any kind of respiratory problems to interfere with their growth. The experimental group received a continuously warmed feeding of bolus feedings via the Guardian warmer, and the control group received human milk feedings warmed with the standard milk method, which is the hot water bath for the bolus feedings. Tolerance and weight gain over the 10-day period were used to evaluate the effectiveness of the continuous milk feedings. Statistical tests, oh, I guess I should have said that. So statistical tests that we used a chi-square analysis to determine demographic differences in weight gain between the groups, as well as the t-test for weight gains between the groups. And then we did a secondary analysis where we looked at length and FOC. So here's our demographic information. There were no differences in gender, ethnicity, birth weight, gestational age at the time of study, or starting weight. If you'll notice, our birth weight was a little bit lower in the standard warming group than the continuous warming group, but that didn't reach statistical significance. The day of life for start of the study was also lower in the standard group, but again, that didn't reach statistical significance. We had exactly the same number of males and females in each side of the group, which I'm not sure how that happened since it was randomized, but it was quite nice to see. And then feeding tolerance was measured by using our residual algorithm. So we have an algorithm that tells the nurses when to hold the feedings, and it has to be more than 30% of the feeding. 2 babies in each group had the feeding held once, and that was following an ROP exam. So looking at the results, we found a statistically significant difference in weight gain between the continuous milk and the standard milk warming group. And it came out to about 68 grams over the 10-day period, or 6.8 grams per kilo per day. There was no change in the length or FOC, and I'll talk about why that happened when we get to the limitations of the study. If you look at the daily weight growth for these infants, I'm really glad I didn't end the study at day of life 5, or we wouldn't have seen much of anything, because it was really at day of life 5 that we saw the continuous group kind of take off from the standard group. There seemed to be a cumulative effect of warming the milk for these babies. When you look at the cumulative weight gain over the 10-day period, the warming group was much higher than the standard group. And in fact, when you look at that lower quartile for the warming group, there was less variability in weight gain for those babies in the lower quartile. So we had to ask ourselves, why did this happen? Because to be honest, I really thought the null hypothesis would be upheld. I didn't think there would be any change in weight gain. But when we started looking into the literature and seeing what might have caused our increase in weight, there's quite a few studies out there that talk about the fat availability and temperature. And that at high temperatures, the fat is decreased by at least 1/3 in the human milk. So we think that perhaps the fat was more available when we kept the temperature below the 40 degrees, which seems to be that temperature where the fat is no longer available or is decreased. And then we warmed the milk really close to the baby, so they got that same type of warm milk they would get from mother. And we didn't do a qualitative study with this one, but a lot of the mothers talked about how much calmer and more relaxed their babies were when they were on the warmer study. And then finally, there may be a consistent temperature of milk delivery that may maintain the nutrient content. And there was a study by Wardell et al. That found a progressive loss of enzyme activity when heating temperatures were somewhere between 40 and 55 degrees Celsius. And it was specifically the bile-simulated lipase and the esterase, which make valuable contributions to fat digestion. Interestingly, a study by Holt looked at the same day of life type of patients in that 13 to 17 days of life that we started our patients on this continuous feeding, and he warmed them. His patients were bigger, but he found that the babies had no difference whether they got cold milk or warm milk. And so we hypothesized that maybe it's the smaller babies that get the most benefit from the warmed milk. So in conclusion, the use of continuous warming improves weight gain in very low birth weight infants. We really need studies over a longer period of time, perhaps starting at the very beginning when we start feedings on these very low birth weight babies, to see that if they continue to gain the same amount of weight through the whole feeding. And then length and FOC need to be a primary indicator as other growth parameters. What we found is our nurses are really bad at measuring length. Had we used it as a primary indicator, we would have used a length board and a single researcher to look at those, both length and FOC. We did make sure that the isolette was changed out at the beginning of the study and that the same scale was used throughout the 10-day period, but we failed to consider length and FOC at that time. Are there any questions? Well, I appreciate your time. Yes, ma'am. So we were actually approached by Medela with a new product, and being very skeptical and not wanting to spend resources on things that don't help, I was like, well, we warm the milk. You don't have any studies to show that it improves anything. And so they offered to loan us some equipment and said, we'll do the study. So that's a challenge. We took it, and I was pleasantly surprised. Right. Right. So the continuous milk warmer warms at about 4 inches. Let me go back to the slide here, if I can get to it. Ugh. Nope. So here's the warming device. The warmer is actually here. This is about 4 inches from the OG tube that goes into the patient. The syringe is here, so we know that it's not the fat coming off the inside of the syringe that's being available to the baby, because the syringe isn't warmed at all. We take that syringe directly from the refrigerator. So the warming device is actually just 4 inches before it hits the OG tube, and it warms it to about 38 degrees Celsius. So by the time it gets to the baby, there's a little bit of cooling that happens, but it's still between that 36.5 and 37.5 body temperature. No, it is the Medela. Well, the feeding tube was not Medela. The connection tubing is proprietary. Right, right. Well, we didn't see any weight gain in the standard, and none of the literature shows that there's any value to just warming milk in a hot water bath or even in one of the commercial warmers. There's actually no studies for the commercial warmers like the Penguin or the Medela. Well, we warm the milk because physiologically that's how they get it from mother. Well, that's not necessarily true, because my mother used to give me warm milk to help me relax and go to sleep at night. So but is that cultural, or is that because when my father was growing up, he didn't drink cold milk. They drank it right from the cow, and it was warm. You're right. It is. Well, in our study, it did show to be beneficial, and I was just as skeptical as you. We had a weight gain. It was warmed in a standard milk warming. That's true. They feed it at room temperature. It's not cold, it's at room temperature.
No, but if I would use this setup,
Mm-hmm.
the incubator, I would guess it would have room temperature at least. That's continuous feeding.
Possible. It's not a continuous feeding, it's a bolus feeding. So it's a bolus feeding that goes through the tubing. So it's not a continuous feeding. It's a bolus. The, the yeah, I don't know because there's really no studies that show that. The only studies out there are for the water bath, and it shows variability in the temperature anywhere between about 32 degrees up to 63 degrees, and there's pockets of both cool and heat in there. So I believe one of them, either the penguin or the Medela, shakes the bottle as it warms, and that's supposed to decrease the variability, but there aren't any studies showing that those warmers do anything. I mean, that increase growth or have any physiological effect. So I understand your skepticism. It would be interesting to do a cold milk study with a warm milk study and see if there's a difference in growth. And I might go back and look at sepsis in these kids and see if there was any difference as well, but we have a very low sepsis rate within our unit anyway and probably won't see a difference.
I was not speaking about this technique for
Uh-huh.
sepsis, but the reason for hospitals not to warm milk or formula is to reduce the incidence of sepsis.
Yeah, I understand that.
As soon as you start to warm milk and
Well, and that's why it goes right from the refrigerator. That's why it goes right from the refrigerator to this warmer, so there's no
yes, that's
delay.
physiologically, that's from the microbiological point of view better.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for your input.
And it gives Medela a lot of money.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.